Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. I'm Steve Gibson.
I'm Ben Matlock.
I thought you were Death Toe.
I am dead from Death Toe.
Yeah.
No, that was fucked up.
Death Toe's a pretty cool name, by the way. I'm jealous.
It's a horrible affliction. I don't wish it upon anyone. And by that, I mean I had like a nail digging into my toe a couple nights ago. So I like clipped it out. And then like not the first night. It was the second night. I woke up like my first alarm went off for work, and I have like 5 alarms because I'm a lazy bastard. So it was like 2 a.m. and I could barely get on my foot. Like I couldn't walk, and I was like, "Oh fuck, there's something seriously wrong." And then I like kind of just stayed in like bed for another hour, and it still hurt a lot, but I could kind of put weight on it. But I didn't really know, like I didn't want to look at it.
Yeah, I think a lot of us get in that boat where you're like, if I don't see it, it's not as bad as it could. Like,
yeah. So I kind of looked at it a little bit in the morning, but I'm half asleep, and I'm also like terrified that there's something seriously wrong. And I get to work, and it fucking hurts a lot. But it's work, so you kind of get some adrenaline going, and after a while it sucks, but you're working through it. And then I was like, I get home, and I'm kind of like, all right, I need to really see what this is, because it feels awful. And I like take my sock off, totally red. Like, just like total like infection fucking red.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, this is not good. And I luckily, death toe can be cured just by washing your toe with some antibacterial soap and staying off it for a good 12 hours. Except like when you hurt that bad, you don't realize you spend a lot of your time walking wrong. So I'm like walking on the side of my foot like a fucking peg leg, like I'm hobbling around work like a pirate. And that fucks up the bones in your foot.
Yeah.
So today hurt in a different way, where like I was actually trying to plant my feet, and the whole left side of my foot was like, well, you haven't been doing this in 24 hours. What the fuck? So that's death toe.
It's not nearly as cool as it sounds.
It's fatal. There's no full cure, but
I can't remember how I came across. I was reading something, and I was talking to it was a podiatrist, foot doctor, and it was like talking about things like, oh, what do you wish like people would, 'cause it was one of those things like people need to go see the doctor for these things, and it is like number one thing he said is like people need to quit trying to cut out their own ingrown toenails because it goes poorly like that. But I do it because I get them.
I'm not paying it to a goddamn doctor.
I don't have that kind of money. Right?
My body is a temple, and I am the master of it.
All right,
and that means I get to perform all the operations I want on myself. God damn it!
Yeah, I know, and I always feel like I'm like a badass like gangster, one of those movies, something like Ronin or something, where you're digging the bullet out of your own.
Well, when it's like
wounds.
A toenail thing, it's that there's a lot of pressure pressing into my toe. It hurts. I have a tool right here that can solve this problem and relieve that pressure. It's my body's fault if it gets infected after that.
Yeah, I think that's the big problem is that anytime, because that leaves that kind of an open wound, but then in your shoe and sock, like that's just like high bacteria breeding ground.
Yeah.
But, so the moral is quit wearing shoes and socks. Just
the moral is fucking your toes need to toughen the fuck up. It's a dangerous
cut
world
them off.
out there.
I'm pretty sure toes are pretty superfluous anyway. They don't serve a purpose. Like, but
like I said, peg legs, man. They didn't have to. They didn't need that shit. One toe on a fake.
You know how
leg.
much of my budget would be freed up if I didn't have to buy shoes? Really, not that much because I very rarely buy shoes, but still a little bit.
That's $60 every 2 years.
Right. Yeah, if that. But anyway, well, I'm glad you survived your affliction.
Yeah, it was terrible. Almost couldn't do the show. Just another reason to not do the show.
That would have been tragic.
All right.
Yeah, this was one of those weeks where every week we say it's one of those weeks I wasn't sure I was going to get a topic and blah, blah, blah. I just had no idea like what I wanted to even, like what route I wanted to go to look for a story. Then I had a couple ideas and they were all really good, but it's one of those things we've talked about where you start writing them up and you're like, this will be good at some point, but right now I'm not feeling it.
Yeah.
And then I found one that's really up my alley. I've done a couple, at least one other similar story. But it's like a mysterious disappearance at sea type story. I think the last one I did, it's been a while ago, but it's that Orang Medan or whatever. It was a freighter ship where they found it adrift with like all the crew was still on it, but they were all dead.
Yeah, these are cool stories, but it's really hard to, like, there's a ton of like missing ships at sea stories out there, but they're really hard to find that fit the show. Because a lot of them are as basic as the ship went off and was never seen again.
Right, and this one's got some interesting twists. It's going to be a short show this week, which my wife will probably appreciate anyway.
And our listeners, according to the plentiful hate mail I received directly to my house.
Yes. Because exactly what you said, for the most part, the bulk of the story is like they went out to sea and then they were lost. But it does have some interesting twists, and that's what when I got to that, when I was reading about it, I'm like, yeah, this is cool. So I'm doing it. I don't know that it'll be real long, but no biggie. So on February 11th, 1979, 5 friends decided to take a day off work and go fishing off the coast of Maui. Among them was Ralph.
Fuckers.
I know, like how nice is. Not only is it like, oh, you can just decide to take off and go fishing because we feel like it, but it's like in Hawaii.
Yeah. Like, that's the thing. If me and my friends were like, hey, let's go fishing, like, we go to some fucking lake and there's like, you get out there and there's fucking diapers and maybe a dead body in it. It's like, yeah, what a great time. Damn. Meanwhile, they're in some fucking beautiful paradise.
Yeah, you get back to work and you're demoted for missing a day, even though you used a vacation day to do it. Yeah. But I guess the story was there. Out of these 5 guys that went out, like 4 of them worked together in construction, and then the other guy was a professional fisherman. I mean, that's what he did. And that guy was a man by the name of Ralph Malagakini. I think I'm probably butchering that.
Without fail, you will find the story with the worst names for you. Yeah. You should have seen the other story I was working on. It was worse. Like, I would love, like, just when this show's over, be like, yeah, I actually have 576 stories here I didn't do because the names.
Because I couldn't say the names. No, that's what I think our finale show will just be a compilation of me butchering names, which will be nice because when we edit it, we only have to listen about 4 minutes into the show because it's always right at the beginning. But anyway, Ralph was the professional fisherman. The 5 men departed on a 17-foot-long Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. So when I initially skimmed through the story, I saw the word whaler, and I pictured one of those boats like you'd see on like Wicked Tuna or something if you watch any of those shows, you know. Not like a huge like whaling ship, you know, but like a big commercial fishing ship or something. You know, I guess not big's the wrong word, but like a beefy, you know, an ocean fishing ship. But, you know, when I was rereading it, then I kind of picked up on the part where it was a 17-foot whaler. And if you're not really familiar with boats, that's not a real big boat, especially for being in the ocean.
Just think about how big you are. You know, well, not you, because you're very small, so you would feel like it would feel gigantic to you.
Yeah, it's like world it's a mansion
at your fingertips. But for me, it's like, you know, I'm 6 foot, so that's not the biggest ship in the world.
No, especially when you consider, you know, that's like from the tip of the boat to the keel, but a lot of that space isn't space that you can actually physically take up. You know, you got like the center console. This is one of those fishing boats that, you know, the driver's kind of in the middle of. So it's one you could fit 5 adult men on it to fish, but you'd be pretty cramped. It's not like one of those boats where you go down and have lunch in the.
To be fair, most fishing trips I've ever been on, there's like enough room for you to sit And if you, it's like going to the movies. If you need to get up, you have to like get past people and shit.
Exactly. And that's all I was pointing out here, that this wasn't like a big, like Jaws fishing boat. It was some guys going out fishing.
And remember, they needed a bigger boat for Jaws. So imagine how small this thing.
So regardless, the trip was likely started about as well as they could have expected. It was a nice, calm morning. One of the brothers of one of these men described it as like the whole ocean just looked like a lake, instead of an ocean. It's just mere calm. So perfect setup I already told you where the story's going, but it was nice and calm right up until about the afternoon when the wind began blowing in from the mountains, which apparently was not usual for that area and was generally the sign of a really bad storm. So knowing his son was out fishing and seeing the weather start to suddenly shift and kind of getting the clue that, hey, this doesn't, this was 79, so it's not like we had all the Doppler radar and your phone stuff.
They left without their surfboards, and this shit's about to get sick.
Yeah. Well, the father of one of the men drove down to the shore in hopes of seeing the boat and signaling to it. Because again, we're talking ocean, but it's a small boat, so it's not like they were planning to go out into the middle of the Pacific. Unfortunately, he was unable to see the boat, and unfortunately, he was right about the weather. So the ensuing storm was one of the worst that the area had seen in years. It's just described as this just horrific squall, like the perfect storm movie, basically. However, knowing that the situation was desperate and his son was likely in trouble, Peter's father headed out to sea in his own boat. In fact, a lot of men from I think the town was called Hannah, but it was one of those kind of small, close-knit, in Hawaii, a lot of the locals have each other's backs. That's just how it is.
You got people fucking combat canoeing out to try to help them.
Pretty much. Yeah, a lot of people went out in the middle of the storm in much bigger boats.
It's just the perfect storm and like a few people on like boogie boards.
Where you guys at? We're coming for you. Hang on, brother.
Oddly enough, all the boogie boards lived.
Well, that's what I was reading. And it said out of this like search party that went out, again, like I said, much bigger, better equipped boats, and they were talking about the waves were so bad that there would be points where, if you know what you're doing in a bad storm in a boat, your goal is to angle your boat directly into the waves so that you're basically going up and riding straight up and then down it. You don't want to be sideways to the waves because that's how you get rolled over.
Play a Tony Hawk game and hit the half pipe.
Exactly. Same deal.
You hit it at a fucking angle, you're going to go out of control.
But they were describing the waves as so bad as, as you're going up the face of them, you're basically vertical, straight up and down. So that's how bad the storm was. So when I was reading that, I'm like, it's a miracle this whole town didn't just like die at sea this night while they were out looking for the fishing boat.
I'm just imagining a boat riding a wave and doing a 900 at the top of it.
900 might be stretching it, but I bet one's done a 360 before.
Oh man!
And I hope
Can you imagine how high in the fucking air you would have to be in a boat to do a 360? That would be fucking scary as hell.
All the deckhands are just like pissing themselves, and the captain's going, woo! So anyway, after braving the weather as much as they could, they headed back empty-handed. In the days after the storm, a number of private search parties headed out to search for the Sarah Jo and her crew. The U.S. Coast Guard, of course, got involved by air. And in the following days, I think they said the search lasted about 4 or 5 days. They would end up encompassing an area of about 73,000 miles before the search was officially called off. This is the kind of thing, it's sad, but it happens, and if a boat goes down at sea, you might get lucky and find some floating debris, but after a storm like that, if you look and you cover that area and you don't find it, it's just, well, she sank and they're dead and there's nothing we can do about it. Friends, family, and residents continued to comb the beaches, hoping to find, wreckage or some kind of clues. At that point, everybody's pretty well come to terms with that they didn't survive the storm, but you still want closure.
Yeah.
But nothing was ever found, not a trace of anything. So
they got out there and they're like, if we pretend to die, we can have fishing trips all the time.
All the time. That's all. Every day. I'm sick of construction.
Even though we live in Hawaii and can fucking do that all the time anyway.
That was in 1979. And September 9th, 1988, so almost 10 years later, A wildlife expert named John Naughton was conducting an expedition in the Marshall Islands, which is about 2,000 miles west of Maui, when he came across the wreckage of a small boat washed ashore on an uninhabited I said island. It was an atoll, which is slightly different. Same deal. Land covered by or surrounded by water. Mm-hmm. So when he and his crew landed to examine the shipwreck, he was able to recover some of the boat's registration numbers, which indicated it had been registered in Hawaii. So no surprise where this is going. Except not far from the boat, they discovered a pile of rocks and a small cross marking a makeshift grave with a human jawbone partially protruding from the grave.
It's a half-assed grave for your boy.
Yeah. So John knew better that, and then I didn't put this in my notes, but I came across it after the fact. This wildlife guy, John Naughton, he actually happened to be in the area when the storm hit and was part of the original search party. So, but this was almost 10 years later, 2,000 miles from it. So when he first came across the wreck, he had said, it crossed his mind. He knew that about the ship that had been missing, but he thought, there's no way it's the ship. But of course it is the ship. When he called in the registration information to the Coast Guard, they were able to confirm that was the Sarah Joe. When the grave was examined later, he left everything pretty well intact, and let the officials actually come in and do an investigation.
Probably a better man than I, because I would be like, this is definitely going to lead to treasure. If not directly in this grave, there will be a map he was buried with.
You see the ship, you find the grave, because there were some other guys with it, and all of a sudden I could just picture you looking at the graves and going, egads.
You're right. You better go report this to the radio. I will.
And then you immediately just start counting off paces, but it's like an arbitrary number and an arbitrary direction.
Well, 13 is my favorite number, so 13 paces. That ought to do it.
You there, cabin boy, start digging right here. So when the grave was examined and the remains recovered, they were able to identify the body of Scott Moorman, who was one of the 5 men on the ship when it had disappeared. So, of course, the first most obvious question was how the little fishing vessel ended up 2,000 miles from the harbor it had launched from.
Waves will do that to you.
Well, to make that even more perplexing, the island where the boat had been found had been surveyed in 1985, so 6 years after the boat went missing, but 3 years before it was found there. And when the island was surveyed, the boat wasn't there. So it couldn't have reached its final resting place until sometime after the survey, so at least 6 years after it went missing. So it's not unusual for abandoned boats to drift at sea for years or even decades before finally sinking or washing up on shore somewhere. I couldn't find it in a real quick Google search, but I know because I've got an interest in this kind of stuff, shipwrecks and just ocean stuff in general. It's something I was reading at some point in the past. I remember coming across the statistic of something like, I want to say there's something like 5,000 or 10,000 boats thought to be just floating unmanned at sea. People come across when you use the term ghost ship, it usually has a connotation of like a paranormal story. And of course they do tend to bring paranormal stories with them, but basically just ships that have either been abandoned or the crews have died or whatever. And you think, well, how can there be that many ships just out there? But the ocean is so fucking big and the ships are so relatively small that you just don't find them. Right. Like it's, unless you happen to be almost directly over top of them, whatever. So anyway, my whole point is it's not unusual for a boat to drift around for a very long time before reaching its final resting place. But if that's the case, then how did Scott end up buried on the island? Because it's not like the boat would end up like just washing ashore and then the corpse like rolls out and puts some rocks over top of itself. So it seemed that
jawbone was sticking out, right?
Right.
So he did it with his jaw.
Jaw, yeah. And I guess I should explain that because I think I kind of skipped over that. It was a pile of rocks in a makeshift grave, but it had a small wooden cross. So it wasn't just like, well, maybe the rocks just, he washed on shore and whatever. It was clearly a man-made grave, just not a very good one, I guess. Yeah.
Really choosers.
A cern or kern, I forget how it's pronounced. That's really more what it is if you're familiar with that. And pile of rocks to denote a grave, and it's meant to be found. It's really like a marker. But so it seemed that at least he and at least one other person must have survived for years before somehow ending up on the Marshall Islands, where he eventually died and was buried by one or more of his fellow survivors, which sounds pretty unlikely and not, it'd be hard to imagine. Although we've heard those stories where people end up, marooned somewhere and they survive for a long time and whatever. But there were no other signs of life on the island to suggest that anybody had been living there. And the Sarah Joe was...
my imagination's running wild with this shit, where, he shipwrecked there and another ship shipwrecked there. And it was two guys on this fucking island lost. And that one killed this guy.
Yeah, he happened to, they were, as they were talking, because they have nothing else to do, it was day 378 of being shipwrecked here. And then they're like, oh yeah, man, I remember... back, right before I got lost, I met this chick at a bar and we went home and man, she was great. Yeah. And the other guy's like, that was my wife, you son of a bitch.
Yeah,
and just killed him.
Bad I fucked your mom insult later, and it's just that dude got a rock to the fucking head.
Yeah. But there was no signs that anybody had been living there, no campfire. Usually you find
they didn't hang out long.
Fires
dude was a total dick.
Yeah, it was one afternoon. It started off okay, but went downhill very quickly. But the boat was also wrecked, so if anybody came in on the boat with Scott, then they clearly didn't have that boat to get out on, although your theory still holds up at this point, because it's the second boat.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is if there's a way to get away with murder, it's a deserted island, and you get back on your boat immediately after you've done it.
I don't want to be lost at sea, but I also don't want to be caught for murder.
But also, we're not going to dwell on this shit. I need to move forward out into the Pacific.
So the only other, thing that they found, it was a very odd thing. In Scott's grave was a small stack of paper. It sounds almost like a pad of Post-it notes, because they were not full-size pages.
Clues.
Clues. And between each sheet of paper, there was a little square of foil, tinfoil, or, something like that. Just a stack, nothing written on them, just a stack of papers with foil between each pages. And it had been buried with the foil. Body. Mm-hmm.
That'll take you to it. The gold.
So subsequent investigations of the island and the surrounding waters turned up the boat's motor, which had been wedged in the coral underwater, just offshore. But that posed yet another mystery. Studying the coral itself, there was one singular narrow passage to gain access to this island, which means there's a very small chance that the boat would have drifted there on its own without human energy. Basically it would have had to been piloted in, because the chance of it navigating through this passage on its own was next to nothing.
God damn it! I bet it's not even proper treasure. I bet that was a drug operation. And there is a fucking cocaine den for the taking.
This is why I like the story, except for it's going to prove probably to be disappointing to you. But yeah, as you're reading it, more and more stuff, there's not a whole lot of clues, because it starts off that typical "it's lost and never found," and then 10 years later it's oh, what the fuck's it doing here? But there's just enough, and there's
Escobar's.
And there's just enough. There's they've literally found a boat with nothing on it. In fact, you can look up pictures of the boat as it was found, and it's the hull. If you, again, not that I'm using technical, oh, I'm a sea captain terms, but if you're not familiar with boats, whatever, the hull, there's just basically the tub part of the boat, but any of the gear, the steering column and the seats and stuff were all gone. It was just the hull of the boat.
I'm going to call it the tub part from now on.
Tub part. Yeah.
I don't know why that's funny to me. It's just
I'm trying to think of terms that the next time I'm on a boat, I can make them want to throw me off, because I'll just be oh, you want me to get in this tub part?
Oh, why didn't you say the fucking tub part? You're confusing me.
The steerer, I need to turn the steerer instead of just the wheel or whatever. Just make up stupid names for everything. But anyway, after the boat had been found, the families hired a private investigator by the name of Steve Goodnow. So apparently he used to be bad, but now like that'd be the perfect private
Steve,
enemy. I didn't
good
even think
now,
of that.
But if you cross him, he'll be bad later.
Bad. Yeah, that's a great, like, so when you're investigating somebody, you come in and you're like, I've got some questions for you. I'm good now, but if you cross me,
could get bad later. Dun-dun.
So his theory is that the boat was found adrift by Chinese fishermen who discovered the body. And there's a reason I'm specifically saying Chinese fishermen here. I'll get to it. Because that always sounds weird to me, like, whatever. But found by Chinese fishermen who discovered the body of Scott Mormon aboard and gave him a proper burial. But though they were probably fishing in the area illegally, because there's a lot of areas that are cordoned, for preservation, you're not allowed to fish this and that, which would explain why they didn't call it in and say, hey, we found this boat with a body in it.
Not going to narc on myself just because there's a dead man here.
Additionally, to kind of support this theory, there is a Chinese tradition of people burying people with it's called joss paper. I'm probably saying that wrong, but sometimes it's referred to as ghost money. Which is supposed to represent wealth in the next life. It's just kind of one of those
counterfeit money to take Karen when he ferries you across the fucking ocean.
I think Egyptians did it too. I know a lot of times Egyptians buried actual treasure.
Hope he doesn't notice that you're giving him bunk coin.
Bunk coin, yeah. Monopoly money is good enough for ghosts, right?
Yeah.
But that's basically it. But these ghost money is traditionally it's like gold-colored foil and silver foil, or actual gold foil or silver foil if you're a rich dead person. So it really kind of matches the description of what they found. It would make sense. Now, some people point out, they're like, well, if they buried them with this and they were Chinese and they buried them with Chinese tradition, like they're not Christian, why would they do the cross? But if you're trying to honor the body of a sailor, sailors are very superstitious, and they just, they tend to watch out for each other. And if you're trying to honor this person that you found that died at sea, and they were probably Christian, even if you're not, I could see them constructing a cross. Like some people point that out, like, oh, but it couldn't have been. Why would they do the cross? I'm like, well, because they probably were trying to respect the body.
They're not going to put a fucking Chinese flag on the guy, like.
We claim this dead body now. Ha ha! You're going to our God.
They're gonna do something that is, it's something that like meant to be at least, appropriately, an appropriate tribute to them. Even if it is an assumption about their spirituality.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, you're trying to honor, I say anytime a person that makes their living at sea or whatever. Like I said, they're very superstitious as part of it, but they also they're respectful of other seagoing people, seafarers, fishermen, or the whatnot. So that part, to me, it's not a sticking point in my opinion. I think this is very much the most likely scenario.
I think in that context, it's pretty neutral.
Yeah. And for his part, this guy, Scott, I think it was Scott Mormon's brother, or it might have been the brother of the fisherman, one of the other guys on the boat. They kind of added what likely happened is during the storm. The storm was so bad, most people thought there was no way they were going to live through the storm anyway. And it sounds like they didn't. This guy might have as your boat's getting tossed around, one of the things these people sometimes do is like tie themselves to the boat. So if you get thrown off, you're at least still connected to the boat. Mm-hmm. And the others might not have been able to do that, or they did, but it broke free or whatever. And they think that's probably how he was still in the boat when it was found. At least 6 or 7 years later. So that part's not really a mystery either. It's like, oh, how is his body still in the boat? Although it's a miracle, because you got to think how many other storms this boat just bobbing randomly at sea for that amount of time, and you still have the body on board when it gets found. So that would be, if I had to guess, like what the most likely scenario was, it was that. But you also kind of wonder, like, did they get marooned? Did they survive and get marooned somewhere? And after a while, they finally decided, let's just try to, like, our boat doesn't work, but it floats. We have a better, we're not going to be found. Let's hop back in it and take our chances.
Or maybe there was something around that island, something in the waters that would come out every night to feed. And
could have been like that. I finally watched, it could be like that weird, mermaid horror creature thing. I finally watched The Lighthouse last weekend or the weekend before. So something like that. I mean, it could have been that where he was, I don't actually know how that movie ended. I watched it, but it was like, that got really weird really quick. Like it sort of went where I thought it was going the whole time, but then it threw some other
basically that movie ends about halfway through it. And then everything after that is kind of just the epilogue. Because you should still watch The Lighthouse. This isn't much of a spoiler. The guy loses his mind.
Right.
And then the rest of that movie is watching a guy who has now lost his mind.
Although they did a good, well, I don't know. Like I said, I want to spoil. We can talk about it off air sometime, but I liked it. It was weird. Tara hated it. She didn't really watch it though.
I love that movie.
I love the actors that they got for it. If you're going to have a movie that's literally just two guys in the first, like, Tara's like one comment. Well, she had two comments because she was playing on her phone the whole time. It wasn't her kind of, I knew it wouldn't be her kind of movie.
Yeah.
But she was sitting there playing on her phone most of the time. She goes, every time I looked up, something really fucking weird was happening or the guy was farting. And I'm like, yeah, that was the movie.
That's part of it. Yeah.
And she goes, and for the first like 30 minutes, nobody said anything. I'm like, yeah. They didn't need to. That wasn't important at that point.
No, the performances were great and the tone was amazing. I'm not going to sit here and say I understand The Lighthouse. But it's one of those movies that's, because the setup is so simplistic and the level of detail to it was so well done, it's a movie that's very fun to think about. All the possibilities of what is happening here. What are they actually going through? And what can you believe about these characters and what should you not? It's a total like art snob interpretation film, but it's really good.
Yeah, it's one that skirts the line, but doesn't quite, in my opinion, get to that point because a lot of those films end up trying to be smarter than they ever are.
Yeah.
And then it ends up with a bunch of people that also want to feel smart. So they're like, this, and it doesn't go that far with it, but it does take it right to that edge. But I appreciate that.
I think the difference is like, are you trying to be preachy with what you're doing or are you actually trying to provoke thought?
Yeah. And this one definitely does.
Yeah.
Because like I said, by the end, it's hard to explain without, and I'm not going to spoil it in case people want to watch it. When I say I didn't get you get to the end and you understand how it ends, but you still have questions in your mind. But I don't know. I probably didn't word that as good as I thought I was about to, but I liked it. But anyway, the most important thing here is that clearly whatever happens in the movie is exactly what happened to these five guys at sea. Even though the only tie-in between the two is that the ocean's involved. Yeah, they're in completely different parts of the world, and these guys are on a boat, not in a lighthouse. But yeah, I mean, and it's one of those, and the one thing that you kind of remind yourself too is it's interesting to speculate. I did come across a couple articles that talk about, as far as the family, they're kind of, this is one of those, it was on Unsolved Mysteries, like way back the original one. There's been a lot of it's been on a lot of shows and podcasts and stuff because it's an interesting story because it starts out so nothing, it's clear what happened. And then there's just enough to be like, well, that's really weird. Something clearly happened because it had to be human intervention and it had to be way after the fact. But like I said, there is that relatively simple explanation. And I think that's probably the correct one. As far as the family, it's one of these that for people like you and me, it's really interesting to think about and wonder, and it's kind of mysterious. The family is everything that I've read. They're like, yeah, we don't, it's not a fun mystery to think about because they lost loved ones. And in their minds, at least it brings some closure, sort of, more so for the Scott Mormon's family because you found the body. But at least the others all kind of know, what we assumed happened had to have happened. So yeah, it's you got to kind of pull yourself back and before you start running too wild with theories like, oh yeah, you know what could have? It's like, yeah, it was probably a relatively straightforward tragedy with real people involved. It was shit. What was that? Almost 50 years ago, a little over 52 years ago. So it's been a while, but it's still relatively modern history. 50. I'm not doing my math right at all there, am I?
I don't know. You said numbers, and 20. I was like, nope.
It's 42 years ago.
I was like, I'm not going on this journey with him.
Yeah,
he can
42. I'm adding a decade in there, but still.
Take it easy, Will Hunting. I'm just an average Joe.
So that's what I got. Like I said, it's a relatively short story, but I thought it was interesting, and it involved mysteries at sea, which are kind of one of my favorite things to read about.
Well, fine then, I guess.
I thought I lost you at sea there for a second. I was listening for waves.
I was just, I still think we haven't combed that island thoroughly.
Well, it would be like I said, it could be interesting if they were on the Marshall Islands. They're remote, but they're not like unexplored and unheard of. They do get some human traffic, not human trafficking, although maybe that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it would be interesting that, maybe they did. The estimates that I read in some of the stories were that the time it would take that boat to drift from where it was lost to where it was found would be a good 3 months. And they didn't have, like I said, it was a relatively small, it was meant for a day fishing trip. It wasn't like they were going out for a weekend at sea or more. And so they didn't have provisions and stuff. So that's the thing. And that's, like I said, that with the family members, their thing is there's pretty much no way that any of them would have survived. Even if they made it through the storm, they wouldn't have been able to drift that far and survive. But that's assuming they made that trip all in one drift. Like I said, could they have been like island hopping, just trying to get somewhere? Probably not, though.
Hey, we still got a full keg here. Let's go island hopping,
Yeah, maybe they caught enough. We don't know how the day started off really nice. Maybe they caught enough fish to sustain them for 3 months. Like, that's why they stayed out even with the storm coming in. Was that like, we can't, this fishing's great.
There's no way the good Lord would interrupt the best fishing trip of my life. Yeah. And then the wave from hell hits.
I guess that's a thought that at least I know I'm not the only one that feels like if I take a single fucking day off work to do something like go fishing, I'm going to get killed at sea. Like, I never take off work for fun stuff because that's what happens. Go to work. You won't die. Unless you die at work, and then you got double fucked because you died and you weren't even having fun. Yeah.
I would rather die fishing in a fucking hellstorm.
Especially if it was a relatively quick like that. Like we've all read stories where they're lost at sea for months and they survive for a very long time and they're like sunburnt and they're like eating their own scabs to stay alive. Like, I don't want that. I want no part of that. But like, oh, you fall off and get struck by lightning as a shark's eating you. It's like, cool. Yeah. Like, yeah.
Well, good for them. I'm glad they had fun. That's enough, I think. That's probably a show. So we'll be back next week. Thank you for listening. Go fishing.
Yeah, but check the weather report first.
Or don't. You could live a little.
Yeah, and give us
and die a lot.
And we'll have a topic for next week.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's our parting words, is if you die at sea or in some kind of boating accident, right before you do, please write everything down and email it to us.
Yeah, don't be an asshole. Tell us what happened. So we have a full story.
Address it specifically to us. That would be so fucking weird. Like,
and bring drugs into it because that enriches any story.
The story.